The price of education, what does the 2015 budget entail? And Inna Sovsun, First Deputy Minister of Education of Ukraine, will talk to us, and Yehor Stadnyi, who is the expert of the Center for Society Research. The floor is yours. Good morning, dear colleagues. Thank you for coming today to hear in more detail what the new budget brings to the to the education system. I think that you've seen that the last weeks of 2014 witnessed a very tense discussion about the budget. In some cases there was real panic and many interpretations of this topic. So I think it is important to explain what is there in the new budget. So I suggest the following agenda. Now I will talk in brief about the changes that happened, especially where the financing of the school education is concerned, and Yehor Stadnyi will talk in more detail about specific figures, and then we will be glad to answer your questions. Do we have an hour, 45 minutes? Okay. So you will have plenty of time for your questions. About the thing that was less discussed, but it is a very important change, the change in the financing of school. Previously, schools were financed at the expense of local budgets, and it meant that if there were not enough money from local budget, then the state budget would compensate for this in order to make conditions more even. In some regions, they were able to finance schools for 100%, and some for the subvention for the financing of their schools was amounting to 80 or even 90%. But the president and the government are now saying that they aim at decentralization, and at the moment the provision for the school education is a duty of the state, and of course it cannot depend on whether a kid lives in a poor or in a rich region. So within the framework of this reform of decentralization, where the local authority has more responsibility to collect tax, to provide for some local functions, but at the same time the financing of the school has been brought to this nationwide level, and all the money for the schools will come from the Ministry of Education directly to regions and districts, and there the money will be distributed according to a certain formula. This is rather strange within the context of decentralization, but this means that the state is responsible for provision of equal access to education, irrespectively of where kids live. Previously, the Ministry of Education was not involved in financing of education at all. Even the figures about financing the sphere were not coming through the Ministry of Education. I'm glad to tell you that yesterday the government has adopted a decision about how to distribute this subvention. We're the first among other ministries to have done this, and this means that there probably won't be serious delays in paying salaries to teachers. This is the same situation is with the preparation of working personnel. Again, the state nationwide subvention, and this is one of the reforms of the government that is going to happen. And now about the financing of some specific figures. If we talk about the financing of higher education, then there are no significant changes in this sector. If we have a look at the money allocated by the Ministry of Education for the financing of the State Commission, then these figures are even higher than last year. But of course, you have to take into account that the ministry now is responsible for the universities from the system of the state fiscal service and the ministry for agro-industrial sphere. This means that financing has been raised to a certain level, but the number of universities has increased. At the moment, this looks like this won't hit the universities seriously, but we do have the issue about financing communal services, for which there have been not enough money for years, but other radical changes are not planned. As far as other details are concerned, I pass the floor to Yehor, who will probably tell you in more detail about financing.
In general, I would like to remind that it's not just about the budget itself, it's about the law 768, which introduced changes, social changes to the law and to the budget. And if we look at that in total, then we can only say what will be the budget for science and education for the next year. We'll talk about some aspects. The colleagues, I would like to refer you to our publication on our website. As Ina said, if we take the Ministry of Education, there are no reductions. The funding is increased 3%. If we take the line training of the personnel for the external exams, then there is the increase by 64 million. There are some increases which I do not understand. Maybe Ina will explain it. There's quite a big increase of financing for training the personnel in the first and second level of accreditation by 800 million compared to 2014. But again, if I'm talking about personnel training, it's not just the Ministry of Education. We have 24 different ministries and agencies which have the personnel training or advanced training. The biggest increase is for law enforcement bodies, Ministry of Defense, National Guard, Ministry of the Interior, and State Border Service for training. If we take funding of science, I will talk about that later, but the social amendments which were in the law 768. In the beginning, when that was at the stage of the draft, they were talking about canceling different additional payments to teachers, but in the final version, this is all absent. What is in the final version? And the norms and amendments which are directed towards optimization of school network. First of all, in the rural activities, because that cancels two moratoria for closing skills, cancels the norm that closing of schools in the rural area could take place only if the community approves this, and also the law cancels the norm that the schools in villages should be open irrespective of the number of students. And such guarantees time ago led to abnormal situation with the financing of the cost of teaching one student in a village compared to the city. If we remove all these guarantees, then the ministry and the local authorities have to very carefully follow that there's no closing everywhere. And I believe that it's illogical to cancel the privileges for free transportation. If they cancel the free transportation for teachers and school children in rural area, would be wrong. So it's not that the students for the students in the cities, but the worst it hits the rural areas where it is so important for children to get to schools. Also, the privileged transportation by railway has been preserved, or subsidies. Another subsidy is or a reduction is reducing the pension for scientific personnel, but that does not concern those who are already receiving pensions. But as to paying for salaries, the law 76A does not cancel any norms here, but the budget in the final provisions and amendments to the budget code and the final provisions have a lot of norms, and also there is such thing that they said that the Cabinet of Ministers will be implementing it in accordance with what is affordable in 2015. That basically leads to misunderstanding. For example, it refers to the whole law on higher education. The law on higher education falls under that norm. Can we count on full-fledged funding of research in the national and research universities, which is guaranteed in the law on higher education, or additional payments? That is a big question. Now I will move to financing the science. We still have the discussion that the reform of financing the science in Ukraine is to be implemented, but it's not being implemented, and every budget shows how badly money is distributed. We see that the biggest part of money is allocated to the Academy of Sciences and 5 sectoral academies of sciences. Some part of it is allocated to the Ministry of Education and Science this year. They will have increase up to 344 million, which is 18% more than last year. But at the same time, besides the Academy of Sciences and the Ministry of Education, we also have 18 agencies, ministries, which finance research and scientific developments. And if we calculate it, the total will be 380 million hryvnia. So our budget distributes the money not at a competitive basis, and also distributes it to different agencies. The experience of leading countries and not so much developed countries shows that the money ought to be left in one fund, and then on a competitive basis they ought to be allocated. This is probably not possible in every sphere. And now let's move to Q&A session.
Thank you, Yehor, for the details about the financing of education. I just want to repeat that the preservation of the level of salaries was the principal issue in which the Ministry of Education has not ceded any ground, and any changes to laws that would cancel any accruement were not introduced lately, and this is the common joint achievement of the Committee on Education and the trade unions. So if we manage to fulfill the budget that is planned now, then there won't be any cuts. At the moment, we are open for questions. What is the policy of the Ministry of Education as far as Ukrainian textbooks are concerned? I think you've seen in the budget that there's a significant decrease in the money that was meant to finance the textbooks, and it is planned that the textbooks will remain free for those who cannot afford buying them. But the procedure of commissioning the textbooks will be changed. We will break the link between some authors and public and publishing houses. This was a corruption element. I think that you know that at the moment the respective institute in the establishment is being reorganized. It will be registered very soon, and however the textbooks for the majority of population will be they will have to pay for this. They will be free only for very poor and disabled people. And we think that for some representatives of ethnic minorities, they should be also free of charge because of small circulation, small prints of these textbooks makes them very expensive. For instance, a textbook in mathematics in Hungarian could cost 200 hryvnia, while the Ukrainian language mathematics textbook should be 80 hryvnia. So there should be some sort of compensation, but in general the financing for textbooks is removed by the procedure of commissioning them will be changed. You know, I am a mother of a pupil of second grade. Do I understand correctly that not every year the parents will pay for textbooks, because textbooks are often used for several years in a row? And do you plan to publish electronic versions of the textbooks and maybe finance some projects of iPad or iPad use of textbooks? We're now working on the model of how the textbooks will be purchased. It is, of course, understandable that textbooks are used for several years, and we can think about the schedule of different pay for different years of the use of textbooks. and people who use the textbook on the 5th year should not pay as much as those who used it when it was new and clean. Very often we think that electronic textbook is a scanned version of a paper textbook on the internet, but of course the electronic textbook is much more complicated than a scan of any textbook, so we should work on pedagogical methods, and this should not be just a scan of a paper version, but this really requires more time to develop. We should work on this, but you should not really make any radical steps in order not to decrease the quality of the papers that we have, of the textbooks that we have. You have to be very cautious, and there are different international research that tell us about the efficiency and non-efficiency of such experiments. I won't tell you that this is the position of the entire ministry, but I think that where iPads and all this stuff is concerned, we should start from pilot projects and see whether this will work really. Of course, it is possible to introduce iPads instead of textbooks, but you still have to train dozens of thousands of teachers how to use them, and we have to make some very expensive primary purchases. We should calculate everything very, very carefully. Any other questions, colleagues? Do you provide for the budget of education in Crimea and Donbass? It is evident that we do not allocate money for Crimea. We do not control this territory. We cannot even technically finance them. So there's no money for this. As far as Donbass is concerned, the situation is different. The matter is that educational subvention that will be allocated from the state budget is calculated according to the number of school students. The number has not changed. They've been redistributed geographically, and this will be reflected in the distribution of money geographically, because kids went to study in other regions. But as far as the number of pupils is concerned, then theoretically, of course, there is money for kids who will be studying in Donbass, but how this will be distributed, this depends on other legal acts. As you know, that we have part of the territory that we do not control now, and we cannot send money there. But, for instance, the children who are graduating from universities now, they should get the Ukrainian certificates and diplomas. However, in many cases on the occupied territories, the educational process is not going evenly. In some cases, it is not organized at all. In some cases, it is organized according to Russian programs, and in this case, we cannot issue a Ukrainian-style diploma or certificate. So we should think about some distance learning for those kids, but theoretically, of course, the subvention is calculated taking into account the number of children in Ukraine in general. So theoretically, we have money for this.
Yehor has just mentioned the rural areas that financing will be reduced and the teachers will not be able to move free of charge. Were children of preschool age included into that? It was mentioned that there will be some school bus introduced, such system. What is the situation now? The situation is like Yehor mentioned, that the model of financing that existed because of some legislative limitations in conditions when we had a very strong demographic decrease. The network of schools was reduced slower than the number of students who study in schools, and we have about 5,000 schools where there are less than 40 students, and there the cost of training of one student could be up to 60,000 grivnas, and in a big school it could be 6 or 9,000 grivnas. So the differences are big. And the worst thing is that even though 60,000, which could be spent per one student in a small school, do not guarantee high-quality education. The statistic shows that children in rural areas are deprived of the access to the school, high-quality school education, and they have less chances to continue their studies in the universities. And all the countries, including the countries of Eastern Europe and Poland, had this experience. They all had demographic decrease, and some certain decisions are to be made. But that is the position of the ministry, that enlargement of schools may happen only if we guarantee that we can take children to these larger schools. The budget and other laws that Yehor mentioned do not provide for resuming funding for the program School Bus, unfortunately. And we need to think about some other solutions, probably, as to free travel. It's not canceled, but it's up to local authorities to decide whether they have the possibility to finance this free transportation. And now it's difficult to say whether they will have such opportunities, such chances or not, because the changes they touch upon not just the system of education, but many other spheres of life. And from my communication to local authorities, I can say that they cannot say what type of budgets they will have, whether their budgets will allow to finance the free transportation. But at the same time, when the state budget cannot ensure this program of school bus, we are talking to international donors, and we are thinking of who could be interested in such a project so that we resume funding for the program school bus. Because even the state budget has some reserves, but they are not used, and they were used for some other things. But that is quite a critical issue, and the position of the ministry is quite strong here, that any enlargement is possible only on condition if we ensure the transportation. If not, then we will have the situation with the low-efficient system, which violates the rights of children in rural areas. If we enlarge schools but do not provide transportation, then children will not get any type of education. So this will be worse than getting poorer education. TVI channel. Also, please tell us about students' stipends. And that is what is included into the general lines of expenditures for general order. And that means that now the size of the stipend fund has not changed, but at the same time you need to understand that the system which we have inherited from the Soviet Union has to change. And if we spend 5% of all the budget for education for stipends, that is a distorted picture compared to international best practices. And we just signed the order on setting up the working group. This will be the working group which will be working on a new mechanism and principles of accrual the stipend. So from the 1st of September, those who enter the universities understand what they agree to and so on. Because now, unfortunately, we have the principle that will give everyone a little, And those children who have no money, they cannot survive getting this money. But the children from wealthier families, for them this money is basically that doesn't change the situation. They don't need that badly, and we organized already one public hearing, and we'll have more public hearings. And Olga Krivoruchka was present there when we organized it in Kiev National Economic University. This is a difficult discussion, but these are the steps which will not be probably popular, but it's obvious that they need to be implemented for those students who enter the universities. And we will honestly tell those who enter this year that these will be the conditions and people will understand what they agree to. But now the fund for stipends hasn't been changed, but at the same time, we understand that we need to implement the reform there. Two brief questions. What are the expenditures for external exam, and are there any expenditures for universities which are on occupied territories in Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast of the first, second, third, and fourth level of accreditation?
As for the external independent testing, as far as I remember, there's a insufficient decrease connected to the decrease in the number of those who want to study in universities. However, the procedure remains the same, and of course, very significantly, the system of the points that are being accrued to enter the university is changed, but the financing of independent external testing remains at the level of 2013. As far as university on the territory of Donbass are concerned, in fact, there are no higher educational establishments there because the establishments of the third and fourth level of accreditation have evacuated. Some of them were able to reorganize rather effectively. Some universities have not done this very efficiently. Some universities are still sort of moving, so the situation is different from university to university, but those that are evacuated, of course, they will get financing according to the planned amounts, but you have understand that there will be some decrease for them in the amount of money because they have been affected by decreases in the number of students and teachers, because some of them have stayed on the occupied territories, some went to other universities, but yes, of course, there will be financing. Any other question? At the level of 2014, 96 million. About the textbooks, will the school children have to pay for all the textbooks, whether they will pay the entire price or partially, and when this will be started? This will be introduced next year for those grades that had to get new textbooks, as if I am not mistaken, grades from 5 to 9. Yeah, 4 to 7. And this means that these textbooks will be paid for those who enter those grades, but as far as the mechanism of the price formation is concerned, we still have not decided. It is evident that kids will not pay the entire price. If we distribute this between the years of learning, then this won't be such huge sums as when they were paying for the entire price, and and the book remains with them. We're still working on this. As soon as we arrive at a model, we will make it public. The last questions. The colleagues are asking because, in fact, we heard the statement about non-free textbooks. I remember that in the 1990s, there was an attempt to do this, and there was a decision of the ruling of the Constitutional Court. You understand what I'm saying? And another question is, my colleagues are asking, is there a chance that they will be paid for publishing textbooks? You know, the Treasury cannot pay me for my business trip within my duties at the ministry, but of course at a certain point in time there will be payment for all the debts. As far as the decision, the ruling of the Constitutional Court is concerned, well, we'll have to think about it. As we are now working on the draft law on education, I think there will be changes so that the legislation is regulated not to contradict the issue of textbooks. You mentioned two very important things. First of all, that the state undertakes to finance the salaries of workers in education, so everybody knows whom they should approach in order to complain. And then you said that there won't be serious delays. Do you foresee the situation where the subvention won't come at all? And this will become a headache of local authorities. Of course, this won't become the headache of local authorities because they do not finance salaries from their budget. They can only pay bonuses or some additional payments, but the main money comes from the state budget. And when I was talking about no significant delays, I meant that on our part, we have done everything possible so that we bring in compliance the educational system and the system of payments. We have done everything on our part to take into account all the regulatory norms. I have two things to add. First of all, we should not lose vigilance, because we understand that there's a review of the budget in mid-February, which can change a lot. And another thing is that the case of financial autonomy of higher educational establishments has come to a logical conclusion. We have respective changes in the budgetary code, and for instance, the educational establishments can deposit the money they got for some sorts of their activity. They can deposit this money in state-run banks, Ощадbank and Ukreksimbank. So we now have to wait for two orders from the Cabinet of Ministers, the way to realize this right and the way to control the use of this money. Because, of course, if they leave the treasury system, then the system of control should be different. Thank you. I hope that soon you will come to us with a new briefing, which is very, very important, because in some cases our regulatory acts do not appear for years and years. And then we would like very much to see you in a briefing that would detail the issue of money for the textbooks, because this is very important. Thank you very much, colleagues. In a couple of minutes we'll have a new briefing on the issues of the rights of children.